But again, the point is that we are all deeply interconnected. We do derive from and return to the same source. As long as that is not understood in a conscious sense, and as long as that potency, that tremendous direct realization, as long as that remains unconscious, we will continue to project the shadow of our finite selves as separate beings upon the world.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. I'm Keith Fiveson, your host. On this podcast, I spoke with Dr. Judson Davis, who's a university educator, an author, depth psychologist, counselor, filmmaker, and world traveler. He holds a doctorate of philosophy in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and a master's degree in counseling psychology from the Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's taught on the university, college, and corporate levels in California, Germany, Japan, and South Korea, and he's been providing online counseling for well over a decade. He's presently teaching a comparative study of Jungian psychology and Tibetan Buddhism that explores their respective precepts and contemplative practices, especially about their creative use of symbols, sacred symbols, and archetypal imagery as a dynamic agent for healing and change. We got into it and welcome Dr. Judson Davis. Hey, here is Dr. Judson Davis in the house. How are you, Judson? How's it going?
Doing well, Keith. Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness gracious! I am so happy to have you here. I'm actually feeling a little intimidated. I mean, I'm seriously in awe of the work you're doing, and I know you've written a book called The Sacred Image. It's about C.G. Jung and the Western embrace of Tibetan Buddhism, and I want to talk about that. I want to talk about life. I want to talk about the world. I want to talk about what's happening in the world, the shadow, the light. I want to talk about some involution and evolution and what that's all about. So where in the world should we start? So I have a quote for you, and I'm wondering, and I think you'd recognize this quote by James George, asking for the earth. A new order on earth will not begin, I believe, until we all learn to see the pollution in our hearts. And that will not happen until many of us, at critical mass, experience the remorse, a real change of consciousness. Wow. So could we start with that maybe, or start with the whole area of consciousness? Because I know that, from a psychological viewpoint, they say 95% is unconscious, 5% is conscious. What's going on underneath all of that? And what about something like that quote?
Well, I think it's a wonderful quote, and I think it's very much relevant to what we're seeing in the world today. From a psychological standpoint, especially depth psychology, we know that there is this huge universe that exists within us that we are not normally conscious of. And it may come through in the form of dreams, through visionary experience. It may be in some way elicited by images that we encounter in the so-called outside world, which actually reflect inner processes. But in relation to the present state of the world today and the direction to which we're going, and the need for all of us to accept, uncover, and deal directly with our shadow aspects, I think this is what we're seeing in the world today. We live in a time of great discord and division. We're seeing all of the institutions and paradigms break down. It's very much present in the American political discord, but we see it everywhere. And we also see our environment disintegrating as a result of our behaviors and our inability to understand the interconnection between humanity and the natural world. And this is something that Carl Jung held very dear. And he also had a vision which has been brought forth in modern times through the work of Christopher Beisch and Stanislav Grof, but especially Beisch.
Okay, wait. Before we get over to Beisch, I want to back the truck up a bit, all right? Because what you just dropped there was some really intense, heavy nuggets, right? You know, there's this other quote that I think is a Carl Jung quote, which is, "We are not the main event. We take on the persona of the world, unus mundus," right? And this whole idea of what you're saying, I mean, we're kind of the world reflects us, and we reflect the world, right? You know, it's that, and I believe we're like dealing with a collective trauma. And it's a collective trauma that's like impacted the world. And, you know, because we are of the world, we are, you know, we are made of the world. We are made of stars, right? So how can we not feel the trauma that's going on in the environment and the, you know, with the oceans, with the species that, you know, with life forms? You know, is that kind of what you're talking about when you talk about the shadow, this sort of sense of the shadow? Is that what you mean in some way?
Well, it's very much related to what you just outlined. I think in human incarnation on this planet, we are finite beings. But as Jung so beautifully articulated, and of course this is central to Tibetan Buddhism and other disciplines, our true nature is infinite. We derive from a timeless source of tremendous immensity, of essentially no boundaries. This is the non-local, all-encompassing paradigm of modern physics, and that's another story. But in relation to the shadow, I think living as a finite being and not understanding our interconnection to the natural world, and not understanding the ways in which we project our own limitations upon others, upon political viewpoints, of any number of contexts. All of this is in many ways destructive. And because the human species has not yet really evolved to a point in which much of this infinite awareness has manifested on a planetary level, because we remain such limited, finite beings, we have continued to approach the natural world and ourselves from a very limited perspective. And that
from a point of individuation, that somehow we're separate from, not of. We're all kind of, you know, I was with indigenous Native American Indian over the weekend. He spoke at a conference I was at, and he said, you know, we're all circles. We you know, the West, the white man doesn't realize that we're all circles. We're all interconnected. What flows through you flows through me. We're all of the earth. We're all, you know, we're all hurting each other, and you're my brother, and you're my sister, and you're my family. We're all of the same family, you know?
Not only of the same family, but of the same essential substance, of the same source. The term unus mundus, which you referenced earlier, is Latin for one world, or one unitary world, which Jung articulated in his work, having discovered this in medieval alchemy, which is all about taking the separations in the world and merging them into a unified form. And it had on an exterior or exoteric level the association with chemical processes, but there was very much a psychological and spiritual aspect to the work of many of the alchemists. And Jung integrated this into his opus, or great work, his psychological theories. It really became the cornerstone of his late work. But again, the point is that we are all deeply interconnected. We do derive from and return to the same source. As long as that is not understood in a conscious sense, and as long as that potency, that tremendous, the energy that comes with that direct realization, as long as that remains unconscious, we will continue to project the shadow of our finite selves as separate beings upon the world. And this, I believe, is the greatest process, the greatest challenge that we are facing. We are in the grips of a birth episode in which the old paradigm is dying away and we are bringing forth or birthing a new awareness. That requires the dissolution, the destruction of not only existing paradigms, and of course the most prevalent paradigm of the last 300 years is scientific materialism, which is all about man being separate from nature, man being the dominant species. And this is very much a sort of misdirection in relation to our broader interconnectedness. But it also goes on very much between people, our relationships, our social constructs, our ability to understand and accept, as your earlier point very nicely articulated, the fact that we are interconnected with Native Indians, with people of other backgrounds and ethnic traditions. And really, as Jung pointed out, our reach in the collective unconscious, what we carry within us and what we bring forth into this world, extends back hundreds of thousands of years. And it also extends into the future, because in that state of origin, we are in not a finite state, but an infinite state, a timeless state, a state in which boundaries dissolve.
Oh man, come on, Judson, you're really talking my language now. You know, you're talking about stuff that I talk about all the time, but kind of people look at me a little weird about. You know, it's sort of like I say, the only thing that is eternal. We talk about, dying and being in the eternal, and I say the only thing that really is eternal in this lifetime is now. And the only thing that really creates the future is the awareness and the presence of now, and the potential for us to connect with the opportunity to create something in the future. So, and that is based on our own intention. That's based on, because that's the rudder of the ship. That's the thing that moves the energy ball and moves us towards whatever energy process, from a quantum field that we want to go ahead and move into. So this whole idea of the past and the future, they do exist in a philosophical way, or in a memory way, or in an anxiety way, right? Or in a regret way, regret being the past, anxiety being the future. Now, what am I doing? Now, where am I? Now, how am I being with myself? Am I a human being, or am I moving into human doing? So that area of potential and that meaning-making machine, I think that's, to your earlier point, I was going to ask you, what do you think? How do you think we lost our way? I mean, what popped in my head when we were talking was I'm sure Freud's, Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. And if you don't, a real big figure. He's the guy who created propaganda. He's the guy who created the PR machine and really told us all that consumerism was good. Being happy with what you have isn't good enough. That somehow if you don't have something, there's a fear of missing out, that somehow we're not good enough. Somehow fear, uncertainty, and doubt, are good for consumerism. And I think that's a thing that continues to play out, that disconnects us in some way from our eternal goodness, our sense of happiness, our sense of beingness, our sense of family and community, and then has us being disconnected from our true selves.
Well, you mentioned individuation, and there's a wonderful book by Eric Newman, who is one of Jung's students and colleagues, in which he explores the evolution of consciousness. And in a very brief nutshell, we start as unconscious entities, like a child is unconscious when born, that arises from the origin, in this case, the mother's womb. And over a period of many years, and in a collective context, hundreds of thousands of years, we develop an ever-increasing state of consciousness, of self-awareness. But part of that process requires that we move away from the original state of oneness, become separate entities as part of developing self-awareness and heightened states, or I wouldn't say heightened, but ever-increasing states of discerning consciousness. And then ultimately, as in the personal journey, the hero's journey of Campbell's work, and of course Jung, we return to that originary state as conscious, or even actually supra-conscious entities who have gone through this remarkable hero's journey from unconscious birth into finite form, having been having emerged from the mother womb. That we go through this whole process of development. And again, we're in the middle now from a socio-historical standpoint of this separation, this separation that apparently is part of a broader plan or process. And the great challenge is to reunify as a highly conscious, highly aware entity back into this all-encompassing infinite source. And I think that, in a very rough nutshell, is much of what's taking place at the moment. We are moving out of the period of male dominance, which is all about the assertion of individual authority, the separation from nature,
patriarchy, and the whole thing.
And we are heading back toward the womb from which we originate, but we're doing so now with the potential for a super consciousness. And so this
is this where Chris is this where Chris Beggs or Box, is it Begg?
It's Beish.
Beish, that's what I thought. Is this where Chris Beish's work on the mind of the universe, is that where some of that comes in from your view, and this sort of great interconnection, the great awareness that we are one with, not above, but one with, and that we can co-create with each other a new world by tapping into the mind of the universe, as he calls it?
That is exactly right. Christopher Beish is, I think, one of the visionaries who is.
Now, you studied with him. You studied with him, didn't you?
I didn't study with him directly.
Right. But you did a lot of work with him, right? I mean, he's one of the people that you've deeply admired, right?
Yes, he has informed much of my work in various capacities, and is most certainly a very prominent influence. I think one of the leading visionaries in what we're discussing right now. And he went through a 20-year period of psychedelic psychotherapy based on Stanislav Grof's pioneering work, and went through this incredible hero's journey in which he would venture into other dimensions. And there, being guided through each one of these remarkable transformations and awakenings, would experience realities that cannot be put into words on a human level. This is very much aligned with the notion in Buddhism of a multi-universe, of innumerable dimensions existing simultaneously alongside the human dimension.
The Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya.
Yes.
So
and Sugawati, the Western paradise of Amitabha, this is just one of innumerable dimensions of various levels. Earth is understood but in Buddhism and also in Beisha's discoveries as being this place, as we discussed earlier, in which we are separated from our origin, which is infinite and timeless and divine, placed in this environment in what is really a very sort of dense and unsophisticated form as a finite entity. And then we go through this process of development. In his experience, reincarnation is a reality, and these lives are part of this long process of adapting to this dimension, which is of dense physical makeup. And over time, and this mirrors your earlier comment of involution, evolution, which is the work of Sri Aurobindo, and this is central to Beisha's work as well, that we are bringing into the human dimension that divine origin. And so we are essentially returning to our roots and returning to a state of the infinite on earth. Now, the Christianity speaks of the New Jerusalem. There are Buddhist tantras that speak of this. There are all kinds of religious parables that relate to this idea. But what we have in Beisha's work is a remarkable firsthand account of innumerable experiences, transitions, dramatic realizations in other dimensions that brings all of this into a much clearer, well-defined focus. And what he is essentially saying, and the title of his second book and his first book on this subject is Dark Night, Early Dawn. Humanity is going through, or is headed toward, a dark night of the soul, which is necessary as part of breaking down the finite limits of our present psychology and mentality and identity, ushering out the old paradigms which are so destructive at present, and making room for, opening to the bringing forth or the birthing of a greatly heightened awareness on this planet, in which through our connection, as you pointed out earlier, we become co-participants in the creation of a new reality.
Well, it's what you've talked about is so heavy from the viewpoint of kind of like going from, being a first grader to going into a PhD of really the soul and the connection between the root energy and the crown energy, and really understanding, the areas of consciousness that we are both the solution and we are the problem, right? That that collectively we are the solution and collectively we are the problem. And if we aren't able to attune to that, if we aren't able to co-regulate with each other, if we aren't able to create a social space for what a good friend of mine calls social mindfulness, the ability to just breathe with each other,
yes,
and really start to really be mindful about the things that we need to do to go ahead and breathe more air and breathe more oxygen, literally spirit, into the world. Because I always talk about the root word for breath is spear, as in inspire, as in aspire, as in perspire, as in expire, right? And it's that loss or that movement of breath into the world to go ahead and actualize itself. So I'm wondering, when we start talking about crispation, and you mentioned Stanislav Grof, both of those people have been involved in psychedelics. That's an area of interest, and we've talked about it on the podcast several times in respect to mindfulness. And more importantly, I believe that there is a mashup, if you will, between the understanding of, let's say, Tantra, a Sri Yantra kind of understanding of breath work from the, doing whether or not it's Kabbalah Bhati or working through a heliotropic breath work process. There is this area of looking to open up consciousness, more air into the brain, more areas that we can access, more relaxation, parasympathetic nervous system, relaxation response, get us there. And then there is the fast track to be able to go ahead and quiet down the default mode network, and which is all part of what the meditation process is about, and to allow us to go ahead and just be calm and look underneath the waters of our consciousness. And with psychedelics, it seems to quiet the default mode network immediately, or certainly within an hour, depending upon what you've taken. But the point being is that then you're able to go ahead and do the excavation, and really do the receptivity around that. So when you talk about Stanislav Grof or Crispation and the work around Tantra, or as we look at Jung, because Jung also did this excavation, into the subconscious area. I wonder if we can unpack that a little bit, saying, how do you see the disciplines contributing to our understanding of the human condition, maybe individually or collectively, since we're going through this process? And, what do you think the hope is? I mean, whether or not it's through psychedelics or whether or not it's through the mindfulness revolution, at least teaching people how to breathe and be calm a little bit. I know it's there's a lot to unpack in here, so forgive me, but I'm wondering if you might be able to help me crystallize it a little bit.
Yes, and I think you're right. It's a huge area, and much of it remains a great mystery. We have methods for dissolving the ego and opening to a greatly heightened or even infinite unitary awareness, and it also can happen spontaneously without one even trying. I mean, these are the kinds of things that Grof coined spiritual emergencies, when suddenly someone's normal waking consciousness is shattered by merging with the totality, and instead of embracing it in the sense of knowing that one is touching one's origin, many people with a greatly reduced sort of capacity or understanding, of course, freak out.
Yeah, and so, just to be clear, I mean, Stanislav Grof, after he separated, his relationship with Timothy Leary, really went into breath work, heliotropic breath work, to go ahead and achieve these altered states of consciousness, right? I mean, that was really his hallmark of his lifetime, really helping to say, listen, you can achieve altered states of consciousness or tap into these areas through breath work.
Right.
And without taking LSD or psilocybin or any of the other chemicals that might be there. So,
right. To my knowledge, although I believe Groff, who is now in his 90s, is for the most part retired, my understanding is he didn't completely abandon the use of
Right.
psychedelics. And he is still a proponent of psychedelic psychotherapy. And this is something that actually is gaining a fair bit of traction now in the more liberal sectors of the field. But he certainly did, and I think he succeeded quite well, wish to develop an alternative to drug use as a way of eliciting these expanded states. And so again, holotropic breath work is one of various methods that has been used over the centuries in various cultures and various contexts. You have at times, the use of magic mushrooms in many native traditions, for example, in the same way that Beish and Groff and others have used psychedelics in modern times. So it's not a new,
no, it's been it's centuries.
Yeah.
This is part of the sacred rite and part of the sacred rituals of getting in touch with the divine to open up the areas of consciousness.
That's right. And so for a moment, I'd like to put the methods aside and answer your question, dealing what I hope will be a more direct response to really the essence of what we're trying to get at, how this relates to an awakening and the creation of a new earth, essentially. Jung and Tantra, each in their own way, deal directly with the notion of the God archetype. For Jung, it was representative of an inherent religious instinct in humanity. On a different level, in a different context, Buddhism approaches this from a similar, or Tibetan Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism approaches this from a generally similar standpoint. Now, there are obvious distinctions between the Jungian self with a big S and the no self or sunyata of the Dharmakaya. And that's something that I think our listeners, because they would be of a more sophisticated, more educated background, can decipher without too much further explanation. But what is the central point here is that each tradition uses God images and sacred symbols to elicit expanded consciousness. Tantric practice is a very complex process with different lineages and different approaches, different meditational deities. But essentially, the deity is understood as an archetype of our inner nature. And Jung has articulated beautifully, and this was followed up very much by von Franz and Joseph Campbell and others in their work, the notion of archetypes, of primordial images that are inherent in the human psyche, both personally and collectively, and that elicit an expansion of consciousness.
Yeah, and I think you did a beautiful job in the book that your book that I read, really talking about the intersection between the Jungian depth psychology and the Buddhist, the Tantra, the Tantric Buddhist Tantra, and the Tibetan Buddhist Tantra. And I thought that you did that so well, really talking about from an archetypal viewpoint, helping us to transcend ourselves, not as that we would in the West kind of devote ourselves to, but more importantly in the Tibetan model, embody, right? That we would embody those principles and bring those into the world, and that we ourselves have that capability to take on those characteristics. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, it's fascinating that a tradition, the Tantric tradition, dates back to somewhere between 500 and 600 of the Common Era, arrived in Tibet in the mid-7th century, and for more than 1,300 years has gone through this process of development and refinement with its different lineages, and Mahamudra, which is the tantric creative and meditative practices. But they employ God images as sacred, archetypal reflections of one's inner being. And we don't have time today to go into that in great detail, but if you don't mind, I'd like to share something from a Jungian standpoint that mirrors this, this notion.
Please, yeah.
In a very much a contemporary context. And I'm going to share with you a dream of my own, and how amplification and
good. I think I know the dream. So yeah, please do.
Okay. So this is my dream, and it goes as follows. I am standing in a room and I'm engaged in a conversation that reveals with great certainty that at a later date, I will be involved in the dissemination of Jung's theories to a wider audience. This realization is accompanied by a strong sense of personal pride at the prospect of professional accomplishment and recognition in the outer world. Then I suddenly pass through a curtain and find myself on a football field preparing to kick a field goal that will signify my success in this endeavor. But when I kick the ball, it hits the goalpost and falls short. Then I wake up. This is a real dream. I was left with the undeniable sense that this dream had special significance, and at the same time was confused by the seemingly contradictory messages it provided. So intent upon uncovering its deeper meaning, I chose to engage in the practice of active imagination, which is an imaginal exercise created by Jung in which one re-enters the dream in a conscious state by focusing upon a primary image and then allowing the inner drama to unfold of its own accord, guided by the unconscious. In this case, the goalpost was clearly the most prominent figure. And so with this image firmly in mind, I proceeded to close my eyes, concentrate my focus, and then after a few unsuccessful attempts, I experienced the following. Now, this is happening within me, and it's happening spontaneously because I am focused on the goalpost, the prima materia from the dream, and I'm just waiting for it to take off of its own accord. And this again is allowing the unconscious to take that image from which it derives and then move it forward to a conclusion. So in a short time, I found myself again on the football field, this time playing quarterback. Each time I tried to pass the ball, I was quickly tackled. Finally, I decided to keep the ball and attempt to cross the goal line by my own volition, and was then able to maneuver my way through the defense, ultimately being brought down as I successfully crossed the goal line. As the football I was carrying touched the ground, it suddenly turned into an enlarged, glowing blue diamond. And this was accompanied by a wordless telepathic communication that can only be described as a sacred revelation. One that arose from a deeper part of myself that I rarely have direct access to, and yet somehow instinctively know to be my true self. And what this communication revealed to me was that the goal in life is not about achieving success or status in the outer world, but rather the true meaning of this life is to reconnect, to return home to the very source of one's being. Now, this is a true story, and it blew my mind. I had just started a master's degree in counseling psychology program at Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is the visionary creation of Dr. Stephen Eisenstadt. And we were studying Jung and learning about active imagination. And I chose to engage in this process as part of my own education. Never could I have imagined that what I just explained would occur. And again, it shows you the reach of Jung's understanding of the human psyche and the manner in which prima materia, the prime material, the images that arise in dreams, in line with the scenario that unfolds, as I explained a moment ago, serves as a connecting link between the finite personality, which Jung described as the number one personality, our ego consciousness, the persona, with the greater self, the infinite, timeless totality from which we arise. And it is Jung's and Tibetan Buddhism's fervent emphasis that the extent to which a human being can connect with that inner sense of divinity, to that extent, that person derives true inner meaning.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So from an integrative viewpoint, I talk about living life from the inside out rather than the outside in, because, who are we or what are we other than the mind, the body, our breath, the food that we take in, the thoughts that we think, the sleep that we get or the dreams that we get, right? And then how do we bring that out into the world in our relationships, in our environment, and then in our aspirations? So what you just described there, the number one, the number two personalities, I was going to ask you, how do people get in touch with their number one, number two personalities? I think most people are living life from the outside in, and they haven't really tapped into that, that inner world, that primary state of awareness, that true state, that blue diamond state that you talked about.
Exactly. And Blue Diamond is one of, this came out of nowhere. Here you have a modern individual who happens to be a football fan. And in his dream, that personal imagery from his personal unconscious is brought forth in an expanded context, so that the lesson, the scenario, goes through that individual's personal inclinations and interests, and then evolves or expands into a collective and a greatly expanded realization. Collective in the sense that the blue diamond is one of the great symbols of the soul. And is also the primary symbol, or one of the primary symbols, in Tibetan Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle. And you have in Beisha's work, Diamonds from Heaven, which is the subtitle to the book you mentioned earlier, The Mind of the Universe, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven. This was his direct experience. He actually entered into the state of Sunyata, the clear light of Dharmakaya, near the end of this 20-year journey, among any number of other remarkable revelations that unfolded. And the point here is that these are universal archetypes. They do exist. They do come from another part of ourselves that we don't normally have access to. So by coming in contact with these extremely potent sacred symbols and images, we create the possibility of linking with these two, this is a crude representation, but these two fundamental dimensions, the egoic consciousness, the persona that inhabits human form on this planet, is just the tiniest part of this,
smallest piece of it,
of this true reality which we are and from which we come.
But really, Judson. So, but let me just interrupt because we could probably take another hour or two on this subject. But here, let's just break it down for the simple guy, right? Because what we're, let's say I work 12 hours a day. I'm working on a job just to survive. I'm bringing home the bacon for my family, and we're just scraping by. And, I'm just trying to go ahead and be present for them and try to get the little teeniest morsel of happiness and joy. Because, as you've traveled all around the world, that, people all want food, shelter, clothing, someone to love, and someone to love them. That's it. It's very simple. That's all we want, really. Food, shelter, clothing, someone to love, and someone to love them, and that's completeness. So at the end of the day, when you've given your soul and given all your cake into the world and you come home with crumbs, how do you find that? How do you find those moments? Do you find it wherever you are? I always say you try to find it, be present to your own breath and your own magnificence, that kind of a thing.
Well, that's a beautiful analogy. But again, the question is, how do we tap that magnificence when we spend our lives, for the most part, in these very superficial contexts? Now,
we're all plugged into the matrix, man. We're plugged into the matrix, whether or not we'd like it or not.
Well, we're certainly plugged in. You make a very good point, and I think this is one of the great challenges. Now, it's perfectly legitimate. It's perfectly part of our present human consciousness to focus on the things you just mentioned. And all of us have to make a living and deal with, relationships and family commitments, all these kinds of things. But I think what we're going to see increasingly, and I think it's already showing itself, are inclinations and intuitions that arise from within that are very often unexpected and serve as connecting links to this infinite part of ourselves that is attempting to emerge on this planet through our finite identities. Now, as much as we can loosen our grip on our sense of social identity and personal identity from the standpoint of age and gender and a background and all of these labels that ultimately limit our sense of self, the more that can be loosened, the more we allow room for this broader energy to enter. More than that, I would recommend to anyone who is present on any level in our planet to breathe, as you said, loosen their grip on the world and relax into what is directly in front of them, and be open to inspiration, be open to the presence of a tree that in some way touches you deeply. You can't perhaps explain it. There are no words or rational conceptions, but there is something coming through, and your engagement with that natural symbol, which is an archetype, the tree of life. This has power, this has potency, it has the ability to establish a connecting link or serve as a threshold between the number one and number two personalities, the finite and the infinite. I am not a visionary in the sense that I can tell you how this is going to unfold. I don't think even Beish, in his tremendously expanded experience, can say it will follow this set of processes or steps. But I do think there must be ultimately the dying of the old in both a personal and collective sense. We are not a bag of skin with an ego, as Ellen Watts once commented. We are an infinite source projected in earthly terms as a finite identity. And the mission of Sri Aurobindo, the mission of involution, evolution, and Beish and Groff and others very much articulate this within that context, is for our origin, which is infinite, to become ever more present in human incarnation on this planet. And that is the project that we're now dealing with, I believe, in this planetary process that we're going through. As Richard Tarnas observed, Jung arrived at the understanding that before a new archetypal paradigm can be brought into being, the process first manifests its opposite. And that's what we're seeing now.
That's what we're seeing now, for sure. Yeah.
The division, the discord, the ecological destruction, all of it is taking place. But this is apparently part of a broader process that is necessary in order to break down our boundaries and limitations and make room for the emergence of this broader consciousness. I want to just mention also the work of Annalise Smitsman and Jean Houston, who are doing some amazing things in their recent books and courses. They are aligned as well with Steve Eisenstadt of Pacifica Graduate Institute. These are some of the other visionaries who are blazing the trail forward. And there are many of them in the world doing amazing work. So I think we live in very, very interesting times. I think
you live in interesting times. Yeah.
I think we're also going to see a lot of dissolution and destruction of the old paradigms as part of making way finally for the birth of this new being.
Well, I think that's a good point to end with a quote from Stanislav Grof, who said that Tibetan Buddhism describes the time of death as a unique opportunity for spiritual liberation from cycles of death and rebirth in a period that determines our next incarnation. So, as you know, as they say, the mind that created, as Einstein said, the mind that created the problem is not the same mind that can solve the problem. You know, we need a different mind. And I think it's that aspect of acceptance, you know, moving into the sense of, and I think we've got more acceptance and much less denial. And more as we start to take a look at psychology, as we start to take a look at mindfulness, as we start to take a look at our collectivism, this collective unconscious or the collective trauma that really seeks to heal itself.
Yes.
You know, through this last 2-3 years, over 1 million people dying, so on and so forth, we really do have a reawakening and an urge to really live lives that are full and be in concert with our own true nature, which is nature. You know, so it's hope. I do hope that to be so. But to your earlier point, you know, I spoke with someone the other day, and we were talking about from cocoon to butterfly, right? She has a process called the cocoon to butterfly method. But you know, what about the caterpillar? You know.
Well, we are the caterpillar. It's interesting you should mention that, because this is exactly what Annalise Smitsman and Jean Houston use as their primary symbol of transformation. We are caterpillars, but we're going to go through this process of gestation, of inner transformation, and ultimately when we shed the old skin, the old paradigm, what emerges is this butterfly, this being of expanded consciousness that has the capacity to create a new world that is much more closely aligned with our divine origins, not our present limitations.
Wouldn't that be beautiful? And wouldn't it be beautiful if we could do it without people, without the caterpillar dying? But I'm afraid that there are, you know, caterpillars have to. There's a metamorphosis there. There's a transformation there. There's a letting go. There is actually Dr. Lisa Longworth, who I had on the show. She talks about the fact that the caterpillar actually secretes a fluid that they wind up eating in gestation in the womb. So it's the breaking down of the caterpillar's body is actually the nutrients that really are used by the butterfly to create this new life. And I thought that was heavy. I thought that was, whoa,
And it also directly points to the fact that this is a broader process that is beyond our present understanding. Right. There is something that is inherent in our makeup and in the collective process that is unfolding. I think the extent to which we can awaken to it allows for participation and a lower level of destruction. The destruction is necessary to break down the old identity, and that's where the caterpillar dies to itself. But in that breakdown, and this is the dark night of the soul,
right,
we have the alchemical process of death and rebirth, and why it happens this way, to what extent it's necessary that people experience death and destruction. These are all primary questions. But I think the more we can awaken to approaching these phenomena with a totally open mind and with a sense of trust and resonance with this greater process that seems to be unfolding, the more we can allow it to become part of who we are, and the more we can help to participate consciously in the birthing of this new awakening. So it's a fascinating thing. Lisa, whose work I'm familiar with, was spot on in her observation. These are the symbols used again by Smitsman and Houston. Right. And you have a real convergence here, I think, of different visionaries who are understanding that we are in the midst of something truly profound.
Right.
And by embracing their work, and by embracing most of all the God image, the inherent divinity within us, we become part of that process.
Oh man.
And part of our collective destiny.
Oh man. So we could really, I just want to talk to you for forever. Maybe not forever, but certainly a lot longer than the time we've got. Dr. Judson Davis, new book, or certainly a book that really gets into the Western embrace of Tibetan Buddhism. And it's called The Sacred Image, C.G. Jung. And it really embraces a lot of these esoteric traditions and the holistic approach to really find a deep affinity for nature, using all of the principles of psychology and tantric disciplines and complex symbolisms. It's a fascinating read and fascinating conversation to have. I want to thank you very much for showing up and being on the show. How can people get a hold of you if they need to?
Thank you for asking. The book itself was actually published a few years back, but I'm presently offering a course based on the book and my other publications, and a number of very pertinent resources, both from Jung's work and Tibetan Buddhism, through my institute, which is the Institute of East-West Interdisciplinary Studies. And the website is www.east-westinstitute.com.
East-westinstitute.com. Okay, great.
Yeah. And people can reach me through the Institute in the contact section, and I would be very happy to engage any interested individual on the content we've discussed today. And of course, I offer the course and then also some spiritual counseling. But I want to thank you, Keith, for a really interesting conversation. You're doing some wonderful work. It's very important work. And this really is a collective process. And so it's been a joy to speak with you. And I think we have a very...
We have more conversations to have. Yeah.
And it points directly to, the unfolding of a very interesting process, which we're going to see ever deepening in the years ahead. So we're living in a very interesting and transformative period.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Judson Davis. He gave us some incredible insights, and we've got other guests that do the same. Take a look at our old podcast, sign up, subscribe for the new ones, and connect with me if you'd like on social media. Visit my website at workmindfulness.com. Thank you again. See you on the next show. Take care.